Hello, and welcome to the second live webcast of Dynamic Range Day 2020. Hopefully, both Facebook Live and YouTube have been reporting problems today, so I hope this stream is working for you. If not, you can't see me, so you won't know that I'm telling you to go and try the other one. Maybe if you could drop some comments in and just let me know from both YouTube and Facebook so that I know that this stream is working. So I've already done a general introduction to the day. I'm not going to repeat that. We're here raising awareness of the loudness wars despite the virus, because that's what you guys wanted. Okay, we're working on YouTube. That's good. Actually, maybe let me just I'll put a message here. If Facebook Live isn't working for you, please try YouTube, exclamation mark. Okay, I see a message from Facebook. Looks good. Okay, let's hope we're good to go. So I have three guests with me for this webcast, who I will now add to the stream. Oh, there we go.
Hello.
It worked, just like that.
Wow.
Excellent. So in your top right, we have Björgvin from audioissues.com. In the bottom left, we have Chris from Mixdown Online. And on the bottom right, we have Mike Senior from the website that I've forgotten the name of.
Cambridge MT.
Cambridge MT, thank you. And he also has an excellent podcast called
The Project Studio Tea Break podcast.
Which is probably what the world needs right now, I think, because it takes a slightly less serious look at the world we all live in. I think it's fair to say. So everybody, thank you so much for joining me here. This is just going to be a kind of an informal chat between the four of us about our experiences of loudness and the loudness wars in the different areas that we work. And then maybe, depending how we go, we could take a look at some of the comments and get some questions from people watching. So, okay, who would like to? Björgvin, you could start because you have just released an album where with great dynamics, I believe.
Oh, well, yeah. So I did a live stream this week with a client or a student or a subscriber, what may, and we did. It was a funky, fun fusion jazz tune. He was in Washington, and I'm down here in Tucson. We did it live with my audience, who mixed just a record, a single song, and I'm happy to report that it was green on the dynameter the entire time at the end there when I was mastering it. And it is quite the convenient plugin to have, just as a peace of mind sort of plugin, if you will.
Yeah, I was talking to Mike Hillier from Metropolis on the first webcast this morning, which anybody watching, you can find if you just head over to the Dynamic Range Day Facebook page or the YouTube channel. You can watch the replay of that. We had a great conversation, and he was saying somebody asked about crest factor and was saying, was that the magic number? Crest factor is the difference between the peak and the short-term loudness, which is what my Dynameter plugin measures. And Mike said he doesn't pay any attention to it at all. Which, you know, is absolutely fine because everybody works in different ways. He does use my perception plugin,
yeah.
so I can still be friends with him.
Yeah, I did that too for the audience. I showed them. So because I was just mixing the one song, I did some mix bus processing at the top of the mix bus, and then at the end of the session, I did some mastering at the bottom of the mix bus. And then I put the perception plugin on there and I bypassed it. And I showed them the difference between the entire chain of the mix and the master bus, and then the difference between just the mastering processing. And there's quite a bit of change on both sides. So it was cool to give them sort of that high quality experience to hear that in action and hear how, you know, things get wider, thicker, and the high end gets more polished as you add some mastering polish to it.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, Mike and I forgave him for not paying attention to the crest factor because, I mean, we talked about it. I think the thing is, once you've been mastering for long enough and you have experience of this stuff, and you've tried uploading a few things and you know how things work, then the kind of the tools become, well, those kind of tools become less important, because I mean, we both agreed that when we're working, we don't really pay attention. You just do what's right for the music, and you know you can have confidence that it's going to work when it gets out there in the real world. But that's, you know, us coming from a position of having had years of experience, and in my case, decades of experience doing this stuff. And the question I get all the time from people is, you know, how do I know if I'm doing it right, what I'm doing, whether what I'm doing is going to be successful and work right when it gets out into the world. And I think that's where, especially the plugins, and also, you know, other things like EQ analyzers and just loudness meters in general, phase meters, all this kind of visual feedback that we can get these days is really helpful with that learning curve of getting people, you know, just to feel confident. Mike, do you use anything like this? Do you pay attention, or because you're mainly mixing and recording, I think? So is the overall loudness less of a concern for you?
Loudness has always been an issue to me entirely from a mixdown perspective. In that you get people referencing things that have been heavily mastering processed and heavily loudness processed, more to the point. And if they're trying to compare directly with what you're doing and that thing that's been smashed into a limiter or whatever it is, then it begins to become a question of, okay, if that is what they want to do with it, you begin to have to create a mix with the side effects of the loudness processing in mind. In a way, one of the nice things over the last few years is that's been happening less often. I actually notice people getting more concerned about actually how good something sounds, rather than trying to compare it peak to peak with something that's been smashed into a limiter. So I mean, from my perspective, because I don't really master, I only ever have to like create listening versions for people on the off chance that they're not going to loudness correct something properly. I mean, I see it from that perspective, but it doesn't really affect me in some respects, because then, you know, I'm delivering them an unmastered version anyway, an unloudness process version. I mean, I wouldn't call what I do mastering in the best of times, but it's certainly now I find that the whole issue of loudness is becoming much more a question of actually having a loudness normalization plugin in the loop when I'm doing mix referencing, where previously it was more a question of, okay, I'm going to have to peak match these files and get a similar subjective loudness for a given peak level. That's not really the issue as much anymore. It's more to do with, actually, if I sit them at the same loudness, which one sounds better, rather than which one, how can I get away with the fewest side effects of having to drive it as hard as this thing they're referencing against?
I mean, that's great to hear, because that, you know, that's my hope. That's what I hope is going to happen. The kind of the side effect. I know lots of people find the whole loudness normalization thing online, you know, tough to deal with and challenging to understand and just annoying, basically, because they have their mix. They think it sounds a certain way. They put it online. The loudness gets adjusted. It probably gets turned down if it's fairly loud, and then they kind of, you know, they're like, well, what happened there? But yeah, my hope is that over time that will trigger them to kind of find out about this stuff and look into it and realize and compare things exactly as you say, loudness matching, and that will give us the opportunity for those who want to take advantage of, you know, the fact that you don't have to be super loud. You know,
what does surprise me, actually, because the other capacity I see this in is from doing the mix review column for Sound on Sound, where I'm looking at commercial releases and directly comparing them. And it does still surprise me, given how far we've come on the loudness normalization track, how often you encounter stuff that is suffering from being mashed into the end stops. And where it's not like a different version that's been streamed, it is the mashed version that you're streaming as well. And it seems like people are still, it's the insecurity of it is the point.
I think it is. I mean, I've said before, there's a blog post out there somewhere where there's at least 7 steps between somebody with an acoustic guitar coming up with a tune and getting the thing out into the world. And there's probably a different person at every, you know, there'll be the artist, the recording engineer, the mixer, the producer, label exec, A&R person, and marketing division, whatever, you know, however you want to split it up. And if any one of those people starts to think, oh, it's not quite as loud as so-and-so, or gets concerned about that, they can kind of spread the FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt through the production chain, you know, and things kind of move in that direction as a result. It's interesting what you say about the mixes as well, because I mean, Mike agreed that mastering engineers find it challenging because we get a lot of the blame for all of this pointed in our direction. I think that's kind of valid historically in terms of mastering engineers pushing the levels up over the years. But these days, it's almost as much of a problem where the mixes that come in are already, like you say, super loud. And it's not kind of a mastering reference versus a mix. That's the mix.
Yeah, and actually, what I found on a number of occasions is you can clearly see that there are mixes or masters that have been released that must have been mastered from a clipped original file, because you can see this kind of flat topping of the waveform that's on a tilt, which basically means they've probably high pass filtered a clipped mix and then remastered it and relimited it, like from some really big names who are clearly clipping heavily and delivering a clipped file to the mastering engineer, and it not getting thrown back at them.
Chris, have you come across? I mean, when you're working, our clients demanding? Do your clients require like high loudness levels, or
some will for sure. Especially when mixing rock or pop, they're going to tend to ask for a loud, master. What I've been doing lately is to set up right away the amount of loudness I want at the end of the project. So I mix into it right away. So I can make my mixing decisions with that in mind. So if I need to add a limiter at the end of the chain, I will mix into the limiter and then remove it afterwards before mastering. So this way I can avoid smash things up, especially with kick, snare, and all those punchy elements of a rock song or a pop song. So if I mix directly into a limiter, like I love your rules, Ian, when you talk about short-term lofts, focusing on the high part, the more energetic part of a song, and set that up to aiming like -10 or so, so this is kind of my standard anyways, so this is what I'm going to aim for on highest peaks and on high energy part of the song. So I'm going to try to mix into that right away. So this way, most of the time, I'm not going to need to add too much compression directly down the chain, so based on those decisions are going to be made based on what I have on the mix bus as far as the loudness goes.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting as well, because I think, something else that Mike and I touched on this morning is that a lot of it's kind of the big name mixing engineers out there have, I've heard them saying that they've had bad experiences in the past where they've delivered mixes which have then been mastered very aggressively and they haven't been happy with the results. So they're doing something similar to what you're talking about, in the sense that they're trying to make those mastering decisions ahead of the game, to prevent that, so that they can hear what's happening at the mix stage and they can cope with that, which that makes sense. But the challenge is to have a good perspective on that, to be comparing with references that are suitable for the music,
sure.
and also having a monitoring system that's capable where you can hear all of the side effects of that processing. And I mean, if you're following my guidelines, Chris, I think you're going to be fine, because they're not, those are not super loud recommendations, right? So for anybody watching, there's a blog post where I talk about this in more details, productionadvice.co.uk/how-loud. But in a nutshell, as Chris says, if you have the peak levels at -1 to make sure that things encode cleanly to lossy streaming and MP3 and stuff, and the short-term loudness of the loudest sections around about -10, that's a great starting point for getting results that sound great. They're loud enough, but they're hopefully not too loud that it's taking anything too much away from the music. And then you balance everything else musically in comparison to that. It's like, okay, well, here's the loud section. How loud does the verse need to be in relation to that? If it was a chorus, whatever it might be. And that's going to get you great results, hopefully. Björgvin, I know that lots of people kind of, go to Audio Issues looking for help and advice on this stuff. Do you get a lot of questions about loudness and streaming loudness, or are people not focused on that? I mean, or do they basically understand it and they're okay? What do you think is the situation?
Well, I don't know if anybody fully understands it. But
I think I do.
Sure. No, most of my students come to me for mixing advice predominantly. But and for instance, in my insiders community, I do mix feedback on Fridays, or most Fridays, where they send me their mixes and then I critique them. I listen to the stereo track, but it kind of becomes this like interesting pseudo mastering session, because as I'm critiquing their mixes, I also have the dynameter up, the Vox angle span frequency analysis tool, and the loudness penalty plugin up there, so they can see how their songs compare through those plugins. And then if I hear something on my monitors or whatnot, I can do minor mix tweak or minor mastering tweaks through EQ and multiband compression or stuff like that. So I sort of pseudo teach them what I would do if I were to receive this as a mix to master. And sometimes things are just like already mastered and they are limited. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're squashed, but they are limited, and it's very apparent that they have been mastered. But at that point, you can still give them feedback based on both what you're hearing, of course, and then also the visual representation of what they are seeing through those meters. Because you can put a meter on, but if you don't know what the meter is telling you, it's still a foreign language. So what I kind of act as a translator at times when I do that with them. So
yeah, that's a really good point. It's I mean, again, I said this with Mike earlier on, but I think it's worth repeating. People are always asking me, how loud and all the rest of it. And a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is aimed at helping people get a handle on that, whether it be through using a meter or through the guideline of -10 at the loudest sections or whatever it is. But of course, all of those numbers are just guidelines. They're just kind of to enable you to get started. And then it's a question you have to listen and think to yourself, well, am I getting the results that I want following the suggestions of this or that meter, or Ian's suggestions or whatever, by comparing with this reference track, whatever it might be. Right. And yeah, everybody who's been following me for a while knows that I still like to use a VU meter for judging loudness, and so it's a plug-in emulation of a VU meter, but it's a needle meter. They're very sensitive to bass. So
traitor.
Say again.
Traitor.
They're very sensitive to bass. So if you if you're looking at something with a lot of bass energy, a hip hop track or an EDM or anything with a pounding kick drum, the needles are going to be pushing right up and could look quite scary. And so there's a learning process that you have to go through of understanding that, okay, that's the way that meter reacts. And if I look at it on an LUFS meter, it's not going to look as scary. I mean, just a sort of random byproduct recently, lots of people got kind of, I guess, alarmed or astonished by the fact that Zanny by Billie Eilish has an RMS level of 0 at that point where the bass really kicks in, the distorted bit that everybody is kind of, was that intentional? And yes, it was entirely intentional. At that point, the RMS meters go right up to 0 and everybody's kind of freaking out. But that's because RMS is overly sensitive to bass. If you look at it on an LUFS meter, which tries to take this into consideration, it's a lot less scary looking. Okay, well, that's cool. Let's let me just see if we've got any comments and questions coming in. We can all jump in. Oh, we've got people offering free mastering samples. That's cool. Martin says many online tracks are at -7.5 LUFS, and somehow many of them don't sound squashed. And wow, we've got people from Hyderabad and Mumbai and Stockholm and Boston and Portland, everywhere. I think my answer to that would be that they probably do sound a bit squashed. It's just that we have nothing to compare them with. I mean, I think -7 LUF is really loud. I mean, that's about 4 or 5 dBs. The most stuff that I master comes out. Of course, it varies. If there's something that's loud all the way through, then that might increase to maybe -10. But if something overall is measuring -7, that means the loudest bits of it are getting up to -5, -4. It's super loud. I think the answer is that it sounds okay, because of modern tools. We have these modern, all the different mastering limiters and maximizers and compressors and stuff. They enable us to achieve results that simply wouldn't have been possible back in the days of analog mastering without kind of blatant distortion. So that's one answer. I mean, another one is the skill of the mix engineers and mastering engineers to achieve that whilst maintaining a musical sound. Yeah. But I think the
maximum illusion over minimum voltage.
Say more about that.
Well, it's like it's the whole headroom task. Certainly when you're mixing, but I can imagine this is the issue with mastering too. You're trying to make things sound like there's a lot of voltage. In other words, like the levels are really high, or like the kick is huge, but without actually using much level.
Right.
And so certainly mixing is a great deal about creating the maximum illusion for the minimum voltage. It's something that there's a writer called Mike Stavro who wrote a book called Mixing with Your Mind. He talks about.
And a lot of times, like, you can do that in mixing by using, like, being super creative with parallel processing, parallel compression, because you're increasing this sort of subjective volume from the bottom up, not by squashing it from the top with a limiter or something. You're just adding more amplitude at the bottom levels. So, like,
and actually that Billie Eilish track demonstrates another one, which is contrast. If you make a big contrast between the small bits of your track and the big bits, then the big bits sound bigger than they would otherwise do.
Yeah. Yeah, we were just talking about this on a call the other day. It was like, well, if you want this chorus to kick harder, make the preceding part quieter. Don't try to, because there's going to be a top level in which you can go without limiting. So just make the subjective jump bigger from the other side. It's like white space with sound, if you think about it that way.
It's a great point, and there's a big difference between measuring loud and sounding loud. So if you record an explosion, a building collapsing or something, and then you turn the level right down, when people hear it, they still know that was a loud sound, even though the level of it is reduced. It sounds quiet, but it's still a loud sound. And if you take I don't know, a solo flute or something, or a gently picked acoustic guitar, and you crank it right up, the level is high, but it's still a quiet, gentle sounding sound. I mean, we actually did a whole podcast episode on the difference between this. I think it's called "What is Loudness," because it's a fascinating topic, and there are lots of other tricks that you can do. So lots of those tracks that are right up there actually don't have a huge amount of super low bass in them, for example, because bass is one of the first things that kind of compresses and cracks up. I think the last thing I want to say on that topic is just to make again the point that it's very hard. I keep saying, if you back off the limiter and all the rest of it, this stuff is going to sound just as good and even better. The challenge is finding examples of that, because if you create an example, people say, oh, you're faking it. You create, you deliberately made that sound bad when it's loud or whatever. But actually finding examples where you've got a genuine comparison between a more dynamic and a less dynamic. That's why the whole Deaf Magnetic thing was so fascinating, because we, the listening public, got to hear two alternative versions, and they were kind of extreme cases, and people could really form an opinion about what they preferred. But my experience, because when I do hear it, is working with clients. If you get a mix that's been super crushed, and then you say, I'd love to do an experiment where I think I could get an even better result with that if I had something that was less cooked to begin with. So, and if the client is open to that and they send you the file, I have 100% success rate with getting a result that everybody prefers. I prefer it, they prefer it, even though they had that kind of super hot reference to begin with. So I think, yes, this stuff that you hear online sounds okay, but or online anywhere out there in the world, all this super loud stuff. But if those engineers or producers or whoever were offering us alternative versions, I think people would then prefer them. And I've mentioned this a few times, so I'm sorry if people get bored, but it is one example where you can try this for yourself. The last Janelle Monáe album, Dirty Computer, the CD and iTunes version is about 3 dBs louder than the version that's on YouTube. There's a version of the entire album with a kind of the video that runs through it. If you want to compare those two, if you loudness match them, if you turn the CD or the iTunes version down so that it matches the YouTube version, for me, the YouTube version just sounds better in almost every way. And that's a mix. That's the highest possible standard of mixing and mastering. and there's no, it's not like the YouTube version lacks anything in sound. It sounds exactly as it should do. The CD version just sounds a bit more held in, a bit more restricted, less lively.
I mean, basically, just because a Super Smash version doesn't sound bad doesn't mean an unsmashed version won't sound better. Is basically the deal.
Thank you. You should have answered that question, Mike, because that would have saved.
Well, no,
I
just had time to think of it because you were like filling in the blanks for me there.
No, it's absolutely right. Okay, here's a question we can all ask. Answer: are your clients increasingly aware of the loudness war, and are you receiving more requests for dynamic masters compared to a few years back? So I would just say yes, but then I would, because I spend all my time banging on about this. Anybody who wants a super loud master is probably going to know that I'm not the person to come to. So, that's, I kind of feel like that's not a genuine piece of evidence. But let's just kind of go around the circle. Chris, do you think you're getting more of your clients aware of the issues of loudness and kind of at least prepared to talk about it?
I don't think they're more aware, but in the other hand, I get less people asking for loud masters compared to when we used to burn everything on a CD. I think what's important for an artist is when they listen to their songs on Spotify afterwards, and they shuffle that with other music, other tracks, and when they just don't want their track to sound lower than what's out there.
Right.
So that's the main thing now. So everything has been switched from CDs to whatever's online streaming. So I don't think they're aware that much, but they just want to make sure that, I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about the loudness. I kind of say, back in the day, give it 10 years ago, people would hear their stuff on maybe a CD changer in a bar.
Exactly.
And they kind of go, oh, that song jumped out at me. Why was that? And you kind of say, well, that was because it was louder. Right. Whereas now,
in the car,
say, yeah, exactly. Now they say, well, that track jumped out at me when I heard it on YouTube or Spotify. And the answer is probably, well, it was a bit more dynamic because
it was quieter.
Has been evened out. Say again.
It was quieter.
Yes, exactly. Originally, but that's what, and then it gets confusing. Okay, so Björgvin, have you seen any change or not so much?
Yeah, well, so my clients are mostly my students, so I do a lot of mixing work for my students, and inherent in that is the education of loudness and the difference between mixing and mastering and how all this stuff works. So they certainly are more aware, because they're also trying to work on their own music, because my clients and students are bedroom producers and home studio musicians. They're trying to do most of the stuff themselves, but then maybe going to a professional engineer or getting feedback from me or getting the occasional mix done for them. So yes, they are definitely more aware of what loudness is, and it doesn't hurt that I constantly talk about it, and then whenever anybody sees a streamed mix session or a video, the dynameter and the loudness penalty plugin are usually there front and center. So
this is what we want. Excellent. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. Okay, so 2 quick questions I'm just going to deal with. There's some discussion there about the peak level preventing intersample peaks. So we've been talking about loudness, which you measure probably with a loudness unit meter, an LUFS meter. We still have the original peak meter that just kind of describes what the waveform does, the details of those, the kind of the current in the speaker, if you like. I recommend you keep that at -1 because any kind of processing that happens to it further downstream is going to change that peak level. Basically, if it gets MP3 encoded, whatever, it's all processing. I mean, you think about MP3 encoding, it's they chop the signal up into 30 or 60 different frequency bands using filters. They throw away 90% of the original information and they rebuild it, and miraculously it still sounds more or less like the thing that went in. There's no way that can happen without changing those peak levels. That's not a problem for the encode. The MP3 encoder can handle those changes in peak levels even if they go above 0. But when it gets played back, it will be decoded, and a lot of the popular decoders immediately reduce that file down to fixed point so 16 or 24 bits. And when they do that, if there are any peaks above 0, they get sliced off. So that's why I recommend restricting to that -1. I mean, there's people here saying that -0.5 and -0.3 isn't enough, and that's correct. Especially the problem gets worse the louder the loudness is, the harder you push the stuff up against the limiter, the more those peak levels are going to leap up again if it gets processed. -1 is not a guarantee either. I mean, at the kind of levels that Chris and I were talking about, that kind of -10 at LUFS at the loudest moments, you probably should be okay. You might get a little bits where it pops over, but it won't be too much of a problem. But if you're mastering stuff at -8 or -7 or even louder, then the peak level could have to be restricted even further, which, I mean, that's, things just get worse, right? Because you push it louder, it's more distorted being made louder, then it gets encoded and decoded and it gets even more distorted. It's a kind of snowball effect. So yeah, I think
second that, actually.
Say that again.
I'd second that, actually, because I end up importing a lot of things into my mix system when referencing, and sometimes I'm working from like ASCs and MP3s, and it'll often be peaking my meters at like +1.5 from what was one would assume has been mastered as a 0 dB file.
Somebody sent me a reference the other day. I checked it out on Spotify, and on the Spotify, I don't have a subscription anymore, so it's just 128 kilobits per second, which is how a lot of people listen. The decoded peaks were hitting +4. So that's 4 dBs of extra clipping added into that file, just through the process of being made into a Spotify file, transmitted across the internet and decoded. And that was at 128. If you listen on mobile, the bandwidth drops to 96 kilobits per second, and the peaks just go through the roof. So yeah, it's a big issue. Another very quick one. Rasmus asks, the dynameter is always on my mix bus, and it works well, but when recording quiet, soft music with instruments, I sometimes get readings of 7 or below, even though I'm not hitting the levels that hard. That's a great example of needing to learn to use the type of meter that you have, Rasmus. So basically what you're finding there is that the natural dynamics of the instrument, a solo human voice perhaps, or an organ pad, or any kind of smooth, sustained sound will probably not have that many that much contrast between the peaks and the loudness in comparison to, say, a drum kit where the peaks go leaping up and the loudness might not necessarily be that high. So that would have a very wide peak to loudness ratio, whereas something like a flute or a held chord, or even kind of gently kind of distorted guitars, two slightly distorted electric guitars, that probably doesn't have that much contrast, so it will see lower readings. So that's fine. That's just
serves you right for using too many pads. For recording an organ, for heaven's sakes.
How dare you record a Hammond organ? But I mean, for example, you might see it if you've got a mix where you've got a full band and then it drops out and there's just a gentle interlude in the middle. Then yeah, the crest factor at that point might drop right down. That's nothing to worry about. That's just a natural thing, and it's part of the learning curve of using these meters. Is so when you want to be paying attention is if you're seeing those very low values and the loudness level is right up as well, so the peaks are hitting 0 all the time. There's people asking about SRS. I have no idea what that is, I'm afraid, but I will look into it. Query for each of us: what's your take on compression and expansion, to use or not to use in the process of moving from recording to final broadcast? And I'm not seeing the full comment there. Where is that? That's on YouTube. I mean, compression and expansion. Well, expansion I don't use much. No. I mean, you might use it in a mix situation if you want to, instead of a gate, for example, in the drums or whatever. Yeah. But in mastering, excuse me, I've experimented with expansion to try and restore some dynamics to stuff that's been heavily crushed. I've never got it to work. It's just.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory it's possible, but in practice, the problem is if you take something that's really squashed, the way that an expander works is it tries to detect the difference between the loud and the quiet bits and make them bigger. But if the thing going in hasn't really got any contrast between the loud and the quiet bits, it's really hard for it to do that job effectively. People have told me that they can use transient designers and all kinds of other stuff. I mean, honestly, I can't get too enthusiastic about it. Part of me feels like, well, if that was done to it, that's what's done to it. That's what it is. I'm not going to try and restore dynamics to something that, you know, if I can't get back earlier in the chain and get some genuine dynamics back, I'm not particularly interested personally. Compression gets used all the time. How about you guys? Well, I see if I can find the rest of this question on YouTube.
Well, I just don't think that, like, you shouldn't necessarily be using expansion and all of these different things for mastering. Why aren't you just doing that to the mix?
Yeah,
exactly.
Like, mixing is like, you can be so creative with all of those fancy fun plugins, and when you go to mastering, it's really just about polishing off something that should already be great, you know, making it as loud as you can. Obviously, in the single based world, which we kind of live in these days, there is less of mastering multiple songs together to sound cohesive as a whole for an album or an EP. Obviously, we still have albums and EPs, but the sort of indie musician marketing ethos these days is release often and release singles so that you always have something to promote, which I honestly do agree with. And at that point, mixing and mastering becomes very sort of blurred. The lines become blurred. It kind of blends together a little bit because you can't just master on the mix bus.
Yeah. I mean, people ask me often whether they should master when they're mixing, and you know, I always say no. I mean, part of that is my perspective. I'm used to getting multiple songs and mastering them together to make a more cohesive package. That's kind of part of the essence of what the mastering process is. So having multiple mixes with, I mean, I don't get the mix files, but even if I'm working myself, to have many songs and be able to, I think there's a lot of value in separating the mixing process from the mastering process. That's not to say you can't put mastering processing on the mix bus. I think Chris was saying earlier that he does. It's just not the way that I prefer to work. I think the other risk is that if you're using stuff like, say, I don't know, multiband processing and all the rest of it, it's easy to fall into letting that processing do a lot of the mixing work for you. Yeah. So if your goal is to get a great sounding result as quickly as possible, maybe that's a helpful thing to happen. If your goal is to improve your skills to the best possible extent and become the best recording and mixing engineer you can, for me, it makes it uncomfortable to the idea of having a tool on the kind of there as part of the mix. And if you took it away, the whole thing would fall apart. Which is one of the reasons I don't tend to use that much bus compression, which is another conversation we had with Mike on the earlier webcast. But yeah, I think, I absolutely agree, Björgvin. There's a big difference between using these things in the mix and on the mix.
Right.
Although interestingly, picking up on what Chris said, just from the way you were talking about that, Chris, it seems like you're not actually hitting that limiter that hard.
No, it's not meant.
I think that makes all the difference.
It does, because I'm not mastering while mixing. That's the difference. I just want to make sure that what I send to a master engineer like Ian, I want to make sure the master engineer has a lot of leverage,
right,
to bring that, loud as it's supposed to be, which is not super loud, with the rules we follow to start with. But yes, so I still have a minimum of processing on the mix bus, and I love to, even if I master the song myself, I'm still going to remove that limiter, which is, again, like you're saying, it's not working very hard. And I'm going to master in another session. I keep things in, same for recording. I'm not going to mix on the recording session. I'm going to bounce everything and on a new session. I love to keep things separate, for sure.
Yeah, and also it's interesting working with clients. And like this analogy of if you're giving somebody a final mix or a final master that you also mastered, they sometimes assume that, like, okay, this is great, and it'll probably be even better when it's mastered. I was like, well,
that's a classic comment.
Kind of already mastered it.
It's like, well, why isn't it already better? It's like,
yeah, but you can use that to your advantage. You can make that mix as loud as possible, and you kind of do at least a volume, like loud mix, and then knowing that, like, okay, once you approve this, then let me show you. Because if you get hired to do both, sometimes you get hired to do both, you can go like, all right, if you approve this mix, now just wait until I give you like the master, which is going to be just that bit cleaner and brighter and punchier and bigger and what, you know, all of those fancy adjectives.
You missed out warm.
Ah.
I just had my bingo card here and I was just ticking them off.
That's very cool. I saw a question there asking which was the album I was talking about. I've just posted a link to the YouTube link for anybody who wants it in the chat, which should show up on Facebook and on YouTube. It was Dirty Computer by Janelle Monáe. Florian says, in the field of EDM, people really have no idea what I'm talking about when I try to explain them to that their kick could sound even bigger with more dynamics. I have a video for that. Florian.
One you prepared earlier.
Yeah, productionadvice.co.uk. I think it's Make Music Pop. Let me look.
Because it makes it so that the internet has all the answers to questions that you've already you can just send them a link.
That's my goal. Never have to answer a question again. Okay, so I'm pasting a link into the chat. It is productionadvice.co.uk/make-music-pop. And it's one of those rare real world examples. So it's an actual EDM tune where we have they put the song up on a I forget one of the sites where you can remix. They put stems up so that people could do their own mixes.
Like Beatport or Indaba or somewhere.
Yeah, one of those. And somebody created a version that was as much like the original mix as possible, but retaining all the original dynamics. Interestingly, the original mix is about as loud as I would have mastered it if I'd been sent it in the first place. But that meant I was able to do a direct comparison between the mastered version and what presumably is what the unmastered mix sounded like. There's a little bit of guesswork there, but that's a pretty good example, and I think it's pretty convincing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now I have a question for you, Ian.
Mm-hmm.
A quick one. If people want to actually practice mastering and discuss mastering jobs and post their masters in process, is there a place where they can do that? Like a resource where they can get unmastered mixes to master?
That's something that my home mastering masterclass course.
Oh, fabulous!
Does have to get a home mastering.
It's the check in the post.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Homemastering.com. People can find out about that. The current course is just ending. In fact, I'm now going to be overdue for sending out today's lesson. So that's a week by week course where I master a song every week, and a good number of those people can get the unmastered versions to play with. I also have a membership thing called the Home Mastering Hub, which is only open to people who have taken the course. And there people can submit their own songs. So the users submit songs and each master each other's material and kind of offer feedback. That's a great community there. I'm not aware of anything kind of public. I mean, your site, Mike, has a ton of kind of, all those mix stems that people can practice their mixing skills with, and I think you offer some of your mixes, don't you?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I've been considering recently is whether actually to add to each of the multi-tracks. In a lot of cases, I actually have unmastered mixes for a lot of those projects. I was thinking of adding those as an extra download option for some of those things on that line.
I think that people would love that, and I would certainly point people in.
But I didn't know whether it already existed. That was because I'm not really as much of a mastering specialist as anything else. So I thought it might already exist.
So
no, it's a question later, people ask.
6 months later, you're gonna have mastering secrets for the small studio.
Yeah,
library.
I could write one, but it would be a leaflet.
I see a possible collaboration.
My business card
in our future, Mike. Yeah. It sounds like an opportunity.
Yeah, there's a co-write here possible.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just looking through some of the comments here. There's a comment there that's something interesting. Have you ever listened to the album Heartwork by Carcass? There's apparently a high dynamic range version of that sounds really good. I haven't, but I should remember to check that out. I mean, it's interesting because metal is one of those genres where it's kind of ironic because it's a super loud genre, but actually I think if if we're seeing a trend towards more dynamic stuff anywhere, it could be there. Avenged Sevenfold won the Dynamic Range Day Award a few years back. That was a super dynamic, an Andy Wallace mix and Bob Ludwig master, and people were just loved it. So I'm hoping that this is a trend that's going to continue. Time will tell. Is there any research data about how many people consume music on headphones versus loudspeaker systems? I'm not aware of research, but I mean, anecdotally, most people, I think nowadays, more people I'm sure are listening on earbuds than anywhere else.
One earbud.
The follow-up to that is
Yeah.
Say again.
One earbud.
One earbud. I mean, honestly, you get I mean, when the trains were still running, you could get on a train coming from Munich city centre at lunchtime when all the schools are out. And it's like every pair of seats in the train, there'll be two kids there with a pair of earbuds shared between them. Ridiculous.
Do you know on average whether it's the right or the left? I'm just thinking about pen and switches.
Whether if the microphone's on the right hand side, that must be the owner of the headphones. So if you want to mix for people who have a bit more expendable cash and actually can own a pair of headphones, then you mix it right.
Got it.
And for the ligger who's taken the other side, then you pan it left.
It's bad enough with people asking me for multiple versions for YouTube, vinyl, and CD, let alone the different ear that they're listening on as well.
I mean, I have a confession. Like, I honestly, I have to check mixes and all that stuff on earbuds, and even just the iPhone speaker, because I think about the consumer who's listening to it, and I don't think the sort of high income dad with the hi-fi system is big enough of a market for me to mix everything to. So it has to sound good on earbuds too.
I mean, it's the same actually. It's the same for me. I mean, I occasionally check it on studio monitors because a few people will listen to hi-fis, right. But of course, I do most of my mixing on the earbuds.
Right.
Yeah. I always check on my phone.
I think that. So I have a blog post about mastering for earbuds, and that was Viola's follow-up question: is whether people ask me to master for headphones or earbuds. So, no, I don't do it. And the analogy that I give in the blog post is I'm a huge Peter Gabriel fan, and there was a Blu-ray came out of his 1980 something Secret World tour, which was fantastic staging and this great film made of the concert. And the reason I used it as an example is that they had posted a YouTube video that compared the original DVD release with the Blu-ray version. And just looking at it in a YouTube window on my computer, I was like, I actually prefer the DVD version. It's got more contrast, it's got more brightness, all the rest of it. But this was right in the early days when not 4K, but 1080p. So the high HD option had just been added to YouTube. So I clicked the HD button and then waited 5 minutes for it to buffer. But when I saw it full screen, I was like, oh, right, okay. Because the DVD version is full of those kind of JPEG type artifacts around the edges of everything. It looks kind of super saturated, burnt out in some places. Some of the blacks have gone noisy. There's all this kind of grain and grit in there, whereas the Blu-ray version, which was restored from the original film negatives and all the rest of it, just looks beautiful. And the point about that is I wasn't able to see the actual difference between those two things on that tiny little original YouTube window. It was only when I had a high definition reproduction system that I could hear what was actually happening. And the same thing I think applies to audio. By all means, reference stuff on crappy speakers and earbuds, although I'll come back to that in a second. But don't make the judgments on those, I would say, because
it has to sound good on the high. It has to sound good on studio speakers.
No, totally agree. It's just a matter of referencing. It's a matter of this is what they're going to hear if they listen to.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that you guys would, but I do regularly see people saying, "What's the point of high-end mastering or high-end monitors?" Right? Everybody's listening on earbuds. let's mix and master for earbuds. And that's really what my little rant was against. And the main reason I would say that is that which pair of earbuds or which iPhone speaker, I mean, just the difference between an iPhone 5 and an iPhone 8, the latest versions of the iPhone have post-processing added to the audio to make it sound better on a small, crappy speaker. So it sounds kind of okay on pop and rock, but you try listening to a solo piano or acoustic guitar through it, and it's got all this weird extra harmonics added in and stuff. You're not hearing the actual audio, you know? So I think, like I say, by all means, reference things out of interest, to especially if you listen to a ton of music on that system. If you have a pair of earbuds where you do all your listening, then obviously listening to your stuff through those earbuds is going to tell you something useful. But we have to be really, really careful about making, you know, if you hear something on earbuds or a phone speaker, kind of make a mental note, come back, listen again in the studio and go, oh, can I hear that? What, you know, how important is that? Or just try it in a bunch of other places, and then decide what to do.
Exactly.
I couldn't agree more with you, Ian, on that one.
Yeah,
totally. I mean, the point is that if you think of everything, you listen to it through it like a filter, you want to try and get as much of that information so that anything that then gives you a filtered version of it, a subset of that information, will still make some sense.
Yeah, and I think using earbuds or cheap speakers when you want to just check your mix, you need to be able to reference those speakers or earbuds with other music, or else it's useless.
Right.
Because you need to, it needs to be something that you're used to listening to music on. Start with. It's not only a matter of using earbuds.
Yeah, and when you do it, make sure you match the loudness.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you could just get fooled by that. I'm just following the comments thread in here, so I should clarify something. Camille has asked that I'd mentioned doing separate masters for different mediums. I don't. I firmly believe, I've always said one master to rule them all. So the guidelines that Chris and I were talking and the way that I work is one master that works great on my speakers. It'll work great on earbuds. It'll work on an iPhone. It'll work on all the streaming platforms, all the rest of it. The only exception to that is if I've done a master for CD and I'm going to supply it for vinyl cutting, which I don't do, I will usually remove the final limiter at that point. And remember, it's a limiter that's only doing 2 or 3 dBs at most of work. So it doesn't really change the final sound. And that's just because a vinyl cutting lathe can't reproduce the kind of the flat topped limited waveforms accurately. And another thing about vinyl, if you supply a super hot mix or master to a vinyl cutting engineer, they're going to turn it down, because if they don't, it'll burn out the head on their cutting lathe. And those things are expensive, and these days they're in short supply. So, that's the one exception, but it's still the same master that goes for vinyl. It's just got a little bit less of the final limiting. I just wanted to make that clear so that people didn't misunderstand me. I genuinely believe it's, that's the whole thing about mastering. You have a balanced, neutral system. You get what you're working to sound great on that system. And then when it gets played back on Beats or Apple earbuds or whatever, it sounds exactly as everybody would expect in comparison to everything else that they hear. And I think Mike's analogy, the filter, was great. It would be like trying to color grade a film with an Instagram filter on, or, trying to color balance your photos for the book that you're going to print out to give to somebody as a gift, whilst wearing a pair of sunglasses that have a purple tint on them. Why would you do that? That you're going to get a weird result.
I don't know if you've ever looked up the frequency response of a pair of Apple earbuds, but they're terrifying. They're just they look ugly.
Okay, Claudius says that I'm Yoda, the one master that rules them all. I think that's crossing the streams.
Oh, crumbs! I'm drowning in film analogies.
Jürgen has said that I'm a Jedi master of mastering in the past, and I'll take that. I think that's a really good place to listen to it. We've been here for about an hour now. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time out of your days to support this and to come on. And I hope that people listening found it useful. Go on, just quickly plug what it is you do. Everybody, start with Björgvin.
I run audioissues.com. I help.
Someone's forgotten my podcast again.
Then, Mike.
So I run audioissues.com. I help home studio musicians and bedroom producers make a bigger impact with their music by teaching them how to mix and master themselves, so that they don't, so that they can do most everything in their home studio.
Fantastic. And Mike, you're from Cambridge MT.
I'm at Cambridge. I'm at Cambridge-MT, which is home of the internet's largest free multi-track download library, and I also have a whole bunch of educational resources. I do podcasts like the Project Studio T-Break podcast and various other stuff I write for SOS.
That's Sound on Sound, everybody. That's the biggest audio and music magazine in the world, probably. And you've been writing for it for a long time as well. You must have been really young when you started.
I've been working for them for 20 years now.
Oh my gosh!
I know.
Yeah,
I had that moment that you have when you use the phrase 20 years about anything.
I remember reading those like back in Iceland, probably 15 years ago, trying to learn about sound at the start. So
yeah, I remember reading your stuff while I was starting out as a mastering engineer, just sitting there copying tapes, and I would read Sound on Sound magazine and read your mix rescues. So kudos stuff.
Yeah,
that means it must be 25 years, I'm afraid.
Oh no, what am I responsible for?
It's all your fault.
Yeah.
It is. It's all down to me. It's a fair cop, Governor.
Yeah. Chris, how about you?
Yep, I run a YouTube channel called Mixdown Online. It's an educational platform, home recording, basically. A lot of stuff on Cubase. I'm a Cubase fanatic, so a bunch of my tutorials are going to be aimed to Cubase users. And even if I have a lot more tutorials on mixing and recording and stuff, but always with the Cubase perspective. So that's my game.
Excellent. Well, so thank you again. I can see one more comment that I can't resist replying to. Frankie, for you, 2013 says, I guess it's nearly impossible to achieve the same good results on different audio devices with the same master. And no, I disagree. It's not going to sound the same. You can't have something that sounds one way on a club PA sound the same way on earbuds. And that's one of the most frustrating things that can happen to us as audio engineers, is when somebody says, yeah, it sounds great, but I'm not hearing enough bass. And you say, okay, how are you listening to it? And they say, well, it's on my iPhone or iPad or whatever. Some reproduction systems will not give you the same as other reproduction systems, but you can get it to be as good as possible on the widest possible range.
Exactly.
That's this kind of the translation ingredient to mastering. And that's one of the things that's best about dynamics. I hear people saying, oh, things have to be super crushed in order that they translate to the lower quality devices. That's just not the case. Things need to be loud enough. This is something I talked more about with Mike on the earlier webcast. So if you're interested in this topic, maybe go back and check that out. It'll be in the Facebook page stream and also on YouTube now. It's called Welcome to Dynamic Range Day 2020, if you're interested to see that. But the goal is to get something that translates as much as possible. And, then it'll sound the way people expect it in the end. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Please, there will be another webcast this evening at 10 p.m. GMT UK time, where I have 2 more, possibly 3 more great guests. I will be announcing the winner of this year's award, and that will be the final event of Dynamic Range Day this year. But please subscribe, share this video if you think other people will like it. I'm posting ridiculous memes on the Facebook and Twitter streams today. Please take a look at those. There are more on the website. If you go to dynamicrangeday.com and click the memes button, you can find them there, or make your own. Share your music, why you think dynamics is important. Let's help get the word out to everybody while we have a captive audience sitting at home on their phones and their computers.
Yeah, my screen time was up 130% last week.
Yeah.
There you go. It's
and so strangely enough, again, family time too.
Share it with your kids. Get them early. Dynamics are good. Look into my eyes. Okay. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you for the next one later on. Thanks for listening.
Bye.